Good day, everyone. Today we will be having the continuation of our subject, literary criticism. And for the beginning of midterms, we have Russian formalism and example literature as the first topic. And I hope that you learn a lot from the historical surveys of different notable personalities in our literary criticism, the difference between literary criticism and literary theory, and different aspects related to the subject that we are taking. And to begin with, let's proceed with our first topic. Let's define first Russian formalism. Russian formalism is a literary scholarship which originated in the second decade of the 20th century and was forcibly suppressed in 1913. So you just count how many years did the Russian formalists last. The Russian formalist movement was championed by unorthodox philologists and literary historians. Here are some of the notable personalities famous for Russian formalism, or they are the ones who pioneered for this movement. First, we have Viktor Shklovsky. I'm not sure with the pronunciation. It's Russian. Roman Jakobson, Boris Eichenbaum, Boris Tomashevsky, and Yuri Tynianov. So you try to remember all of those personalities because you might meet them as we progress our topic. Its main strongholds were the Moscow Linguistic Circle, founded in 1915, and the Petrograd Society for the Study of Poetic Language, or the OPOYAZ, formed in 1916. The initial statement of the formalist position is found in the symposium Poetics, Studies in the Theory of Poetic Language and in the Modern Russian Poetry by Roman Jakobson. And if you will be researching about Roman Jakobson, he's really one of the pioneers of Russian formalism. And if we will go back with the ebook that I had sent you, there's also a discussion related to the Society of Opoyas. And you will see how they viewed literary criticism or literary interpretation in their own. Let's dig deeper as we progress with our presentation. Academic eclecticism, which weighed heavily upon Russian literary history, the message-mindedness of the social critics, and the metaphysical bias of the symbolists. These are some of the springboards or the reason why they come up with this kind of literary criticism approach. Then, the driving force behind formalist theorizing was the desire to bring an end to the methodological confusion which prevailed in traditional literary studies and to establish literary scholarship as the distinct and integrated field of intellectual endeavor. It is high time, argue the formalists, that the study of literature limit its area and define its subject of inquiry. Okay, so they want to develop or to have an end with some of the concepts as we go back with our lecture. And I will also open my notes about, we have the ebook. I printed the ebook that we are using in our class. So here are some of the reasons for their beliefs, why they come up with this type of criticism, specifically the Russian formalism. So allow me to look for this part. I'm browsing the pages. Yeah, it's already highlighted here. Okay, so going back with the Opoyas, the following year in Petrograd, the Society for the Study of Poetic Language, or the Opoyas, was formed, including in its membership Viktor Shklovsky, Boris Eichenbaum, and Viktor Vinogradov. Although the adherents of both groups often disagreed concerning the principles of literary interpretation, so you take note of this, they were united in their rejection of many 19th century assumptions of textual analysis, especially the belief that a work of literature was the expression of the author's worldview and their dismissal of psychological and biographical criticism as being irrelevant to interpretation. So this is how they interpret or they see textual analysis. Further, literature they believe should be investigated as its own discipline, not merely as a platform for discussing religious, political, sociological, or philosophical ideas. And also, it is been called as the modern literary criticism, and because of that, Russian formalism came into life. And you know what, class? The battle cry for establishment of what they dub as science of literature. So they believe that literature should be investigated. That's why they come up with this battle cry. They dub it as the science of literature. Okay, so let's move further with our lecture. So here, according to Roman Jakobson, the subject of literary scholarship is not literature in its totality, but literariness, that which makes a given work a work of literature. And according to Boris Eichenbaum, the literary scholar ought to be concerned solely with the inquiry into distinguishing features of the literary materials. And also, Jakobson had mentioned literariness, should I say, the language used in the text. And it's let's go back with the textual analysis. So they have different interpretation of textual analysis than the usual. According to the formalist, literary language is different from everyday language, and it is really true because in literary language we use words that are highly idiomatic. We use various expressions in various elements. As you remembered what we have lectured in your previous subject. What's the previous subject? Stylistics and discourse analysis. So we have various figures of speech being discussed, or the figurative language. The locus of the peculiarity or peculiarly literary was to be sought not in the author's or reader's psyche, but in the work itself. The difference between literature and non-literature had to be sought in the mode of presentation. Russian formalists rejected many 19th century assumptions of textual analysis. This is the one that I had told you, especially the belief that a work of literature was the expression of the author's worldview and their dismissal of psychological and biographical criticism as being irrelevant to the interpretation. So it means the life of the author, the biography of the author, and his world has nothing to do with the interpretation of the literary material. That's according to the Russian formalist. This literature and poetic language was declared as in autonomy or alone, advocating a scientific approach to literary interpretation. To study literature is to study poetics, which is an analysis of the work's constituent parts, its linguistic and structural features, or its form. Form, they asserted, included the internal mechanics of the work itself, especially its poetic language. These internal mechanics are what the formalists call devices comprise the artfulness and the literariness of any given text, not a work's content. So, according to Russian formalists, we have that internal mechanics, the devices, the one that we use to make the work more interesting. Those are the tools. The way on how it is written has something to do with the artfulness and the literariness, not just on the content. So according to them, it's a separate thing. The style and so on are separate from the content of the material. If we start to examine the general laws of perception, we see that a perception becomes habitual. It becomes automatic. For example, all of our habits retreat into the area of the unconsciously automatic. If one remembers the sensations of holding a pen or speaking in a foreign language for the first time and compares that with his feeling at performing the action for the 10,000th time, he will agree with us. This characteristic of thought suggests that we apprehend objects only as shapes with imprecise extensions. We do not see them in their entirety, but rather recognize them by their main characteristics. So the object perceived thus in this manner of gross perception fades and does not leave even a first impression, ultimately even the essence of what is forgotten. So it's one of the examples. Let's continue. Art exists that one may recover the sensation of life. It exists to make one feel things, to make some stone stony. The technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar, to make forms difficult, to increase the difficulty and length of perception, because the process of perception is an aesthetic end in itself and must be prolonged. Art is a way of experiencing the artfulness of an object. The object is not important. So parang if we try to analyze the previous and this one, this text, we could say that uh, it is the material would be great or would be worth reading, not because of its content, right? But because of the artistry of the one who wrote it or wrote this one. Kaya we could say that Russian formalists would separate the content or how it is really what is being written to how it is written. So it's a separate thing according to them. The familiarization or making strange causes the audience to confront the object on a different level, elevating and transforming it from something ordinary or practical into work that is considered art. It means to remove the automatism or perception, and the author's purpose is to create the vision which results from that the automatized perception. The automatize, you make it strange, you make it different, the familiarization. So it means it is the material should not be related or hindi natin dapat ibinudugsong sa experience ng author. Okay? Let's move forward. By creating the work artistically, its perception is impeded and the greatest possible effect is produced through the slowness of the perception. Shklovsky points out that Tolstoy's Consumer is an example of defamiliarization because the narrator is a horse, making the work seem strange and unfamiliar. So you try to remove the experience of the author. You try to make another person or another thing as the author, the narrator. So the story, or he would not make it as personalized. So it would seem unfamiliar to the narrator because the narrator, as you can see, there is a horse. Unlike, what if the narrator is a person, di ba? So to make it defamiliarize, the narrator is no longer connected to the story. I understood well that they said about whipping and Christianity, but then I was absolutely in the dark. What's the meaning of his call? From these phrases, I saw that people thought there was some sort of connection between me and the stable. At the time, I simply could not understand the connection. Only much later, when they separated me from the other horses, did I begin to understand. But even then, I simply could not see what it meant when they called me man's property. The words, my horse, referred to me, a living horse, and seemed as strange to me as the words my land, my air, my water. So this is a sample excerpt from a sample literary material under Russian formalism. Another example, Animal Farm is an example of defamiliarization in English literature because all of the characters are animals. This rescues the work from becoming just another political piece about the evils, communism, and the corruption of power and transforms it into artistic literature. Defamiliarization not only forces the audience to see Animal Farm as art, but allows the author and audience to distance themselves from the seriousness of the message so that the piece can be enjoyed as art and does not become just as another political rant. So as you can see there, if you have watched the movie Animal Farm by based from the novel of George Orwell, if I'm not mistaken, why was it termed as another example of defamiliarization? Because, yes, as you can see on the picture, the characters are the animals. The experience of the animals there, as narrated by them, would not be connected to the experience of the author. And also, for the story to avoid sympathy or too much connection with people. What do you mean by that? If the characters would be person or people, it would tend to be serious or more serious than compared to animals being the characters. Let's move forward again. According to Aristotle, poetic language must appear strange and wonderful, and in fact, it is often actually foreign. The Sumerian used by the Assyrians, the Latin of Europe during the Middle Ages, the Arabisms of the Persians, the Old Bulgarian of Russian literature, or the elevated, almost literary language of folk songs. An example of this is theist that Thomas turns Elmut's use of Greek, Latin, German, and other languages in the wasteland, which forces the reader to become a more active participant in the process by having to make an extra effort to decode the strange and exotic words in order to understand the poem. One is never allowed to feel comfortable and be a passive listener or reader when dealing with T.S. Eliot. Thomas Stearns Eliot is also known as a writer who can use various languages. So it means you must be active in a sense that you must decipher the difficult words being used in his poems. According to Shklovsky, narrative prose has two important aspects, the fabula or the story and the sujet or the plot. Fabula or pabula in Filipino, fabula is the raw material or the story and can be considered close to the writer's working outline. This contains the chronological series of events of the story, and a sujet is the literary devices the writer uses to transform a story into a plot. But in our definition of pabula, these are stories in which the characters are animals, right? But in the definition of Shklovsky, it's a raw material for the story and can be close to the outline. There is a distinction between the actual sequence of the story's events as they happen and the way they are presented in the narrative. For example, the fabula is always chronological, moving from beginning to end, whereas the sujet may start in the middle, in media res, and they jump back and forth within the chain of events. So going back again to the term media res, which we already discussed in our uh, literary, what's the subject that we had before? Have you remembered the, anong subject natin before? Stylistics and discourse analysis, right? So media res is a literary device that gives you the middle event. So there would be a middle event first being flashed that will give you a clue that this would be happening at the middle. Parang yung gitna muna ang pinapakita bago ipakita yung flashback, bago ipakita yung future or yung mga susunod pa na pangyayari and back and forth. So that's what we call as media res. Parang yung Schindler's List na movie, media res ang ipinakita doon sa approach. If you would be watching Schindler's List, the Holocaust movie of World War. Let's move further. As a group, the Russian formalists were suppressed and disbanded in 1930 by the Soviet government because they were unwilling to view literature through the Stalinist regime, Joseph Stalin, political and ideological perspectives. Their influence, however, continued to flourish in Czechoslovakia through the work of Prague Linguistic Circle, founded in 1926, its leading figure being Roman Jakobson, and through the Russian folklore or folklore scholar Vladimir Propp. I will also give you another example, the Gulliver's Travels. The aim of this analysis is not to probe the satire the stories reserve, rather it is to analyze the fourth voyage of Gulliver to the land of Hohenheims in terms of the familiarization that is used as the literary device by Jonathan Swift. His visits to the island of Lilliput to voyage to Brobdingnag, yeah, and to the Laputa are also written with this technique. However, the scope of this analysis will be restricted to the last voyage. Shklovsky asserts that the technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar, to make forms difficult, in other words, to make stone more stony, to increase the difficulty in the length of perception, because the perception is an aesthetic end in itself and must be prolonged. Like Brobdingnag, Hohenheim pronounces Winen land is completely cut off from other nations. No one on Hohenheim, too hard. Winen, so pronounces Winen, has ever visited another country. So this kind of isolation appears to be good for producing relatively virtual societies. And after all, the chief problem of Gulliver's sees with Lilliput and Laputa, their tendency to fight and conquer other peoples, isn't really possible on Brobdingnag in Wenin, where there are no other peoples available for conquest. At the same time, there are two distinct kinds of living in Wenin land, and it is the differences between these two that form the final part of the satire of Gulliver's Travels. You remember that? This is being told by your classmate in our literary story before. I think it's Jonas who had narrated the story of Gulliver's Travels. When Gulliver first starts exploring the island, he runs across a herd of deformed animals with hair on their heads and covering their genitals, but leaving the rest of their bodies bare. They seem swift, but they also tend to sit around on their butts a lot. The females have bare faces without the long, guilty beards of the men, and their breasts hang down almost to the ground. These creatures are violent and easily frightened. When Gulliver strikes one with The flat part of his sword, a whole bunch of them swarm around him, throwing feces until he thinks he's going to be smothered in poo. Just as Gulliver thinks he's going to suffocate in poo, another resident of the island comes to rescue him. A kind, gentle-looking gray horse who seems to frighten these cross animals away. The horse seems fascinated by Gulliver, and particularly by Gulliver's clothing. As Gulliver hears this horse apparently speaking to another horse, he realizes that the horse neighs and whinnies, from which the word, okay, the word Houyhnhnm. How was it pronounced again? Oh, it's for you to find out. So are closely starting to make sense to him. Okay, the horse keeps saying the word Yahoo and gesturing to Gulliver. The gray horse leads Gulliver through his own house and out to a kind of stable where a bunch of those uh, wild beasts from early scene are kept chained to a wall surrounded by bits of roganti meat. Suddenly, Gulliver realizes the awful truth: this grotesque, violent, brutal, cowardly, hairy, but also way too naked creatures are, in fact, humans, just like Gulliver. The horses, which are the reasonable creatures of this island, can call humans yahoos and keep a tight leash on them because otherwise they misbehave. So the slow introduction to the yahoos or the gross humans and the what's the pronunciation again? Let's go back to the guide. What's the pronunciation? Did I skip some part? Women. Did I skip some part? Okay. Ayan. It's really hard kasi to click. Okay. The slow introduction to the Yahoos or gross humans and the Winims, lovely smart horses, makes humanity unfamiliar and horrible to the reader. So, however, Gulliver is forced to leave the island. The Winim have an island-wide assembly every 4 years where they discuss important matters. Gulliver happens to be the important matter at the current assembly. The Winims all decide that a superior Yahoo, Gulliver, might someday go off and convince all of the other Yahoos to organize and rise up against the Winims. They decide he's too dangerous to have around, so they boost him out of the country. Some qualifications of the Winims. There are no words in Winim's language for any of the bad things we humans do, including lying, power, greed, or jealousy. The Winims don't need laws or a special class of lawyers because they are completely governed by reason. The Winims accept hard facts. Anything outside of fact, you can't argue about because by definition, you can't know what the correct answer is. And they are equally friendly with all members of the tribe. And Jonathan Swift in this part removes objects from the automatism of perception by making the familiar seem strange by naming the familiar object, which are horses and human beings in this example. So are you getting the point already? So how could he made or the author Jonathan Swift made it detach from what is already known? Pinangalanan niya ng iba't ibang terminologies. Yung mga sa halip na horse, di ba, women, yung human beings, tinawag na Yahoo. So it's part of that in a different way. Instead of just calling them horses, he gives a different name. Yun na nga, women to horses and the people are named Yahoos. Thus, he prevents the readers from automatizing these concepts and needs them to think in a different way. To understand the Winning civilization, their philosophies, and to distance themselves from the Yahoos. Swift attacks the dogmas and characteristics of human beings as they are unfamiliar to us. Being adapted to the world of winnings provoke him to distance himself from human world and he chooses to spend time with horses instead of human beings, which means that Gulliver's usual perception of an object is transferred into a sphere of new perception. And that would be um, the examples that I will be giving for Russian formalism is for our first topic in midterms, and I will be leaving you with further reading on page 48 on the ebook that I assigned you on page 48 to 52. Okay, so additionally, the formalist chief focus of literary analysis was the examination of the text literariness, the language employed in the actual text. Literary language, they asserted, is different from everyday language. Unlike everyday speech, literary language foregrounds itself shouting, "Look at me, I am special, I am unique." Through structure in imagery, syntax, rhyme schemes, paradox, and voice of other devices, literary language identifies itself deviations from everyday speech patterns. So this is also in relation to what we had mentioned before. It is also part of the artistry of the authors to use different devices. So it is not on the content of the story that makes the story wonderful or worth reading, but through the writer's use of artistry and use of varied devices, katulad na nga ng imagery, syntax, rhyme scheme, paradox, and other figures of speech, and the familiarization techniques. Okay? And yes, here, if you will be reading page 51, applying Russian formalism to literary texts, read carefully the following poem by the contemporary American essayist, poet, scholar, and editor Mary Brown. And after reading the text several times, be able to apply, discuss, and demonstrate how the following terms from Russian formalism can be used in developing an interpretation of the text. Here are some of the terminologies being mentioned: poetics, form, devices, literariness, foregrounding of literary language, defamiliarization. And this is located or can be found on page 51, running to page 52. So I will be leaving that to you as your individual reading, and have an advanced reading of new criticism, because we will be having a discussion of that on our next session. Okay, so with that, thank you so much for listening. I will be leaving you with sit work to answer in our NEO LMS. That would be all for today. And once again, thank you for listening. Goodbye.